The Walton Expedition for the North Pole is one of the strangest ever conceived. It was the 1700s and Robert Walton, an obsessive Englishman, made it his life's work to reach the pole. A failed writer, he pivoted north as his path for greatness. Although, from a rich family, he enlisted on a Greenland whaler, working the most menial jobs to get himself used to hard work in the cold. Before he left on his great voyage, he'd worked his way to second in command of the whaler. Eventually, though, convinced he was ready, he left and went north with his savings, but he was not ready. He found a ship in Archangel, the great port city in the far north of Russia, the well-named White Sea. The ship set sail in early summer, and by August it was beset by ice, likely the furthest north ever achieved at that point. Weeks turned to months, and the crew wanted his promise that if the ice freed them, they'd head south, give up, and even threatened mutiny. But before Walton could make a final decision, a strange thing happened. A large man heading north on dog sleds, and close behind him, another man. A man that would convince Walton to return south and give up his obsession, because there were places that men should not go. There are borders that should never be crossed. You see, this is an April Fool's video, and I've just described the start of Frankenstein. Robert Walton is almost always cut out of screen adaptations of Frankenstein because, apart from clearly being in lust with Victor Frankenstein, this story directly compares man's wish to create new life from corpses with the quest for the pole. And since the poles were reached, and we literally have people living at one of them, the idea has lost some of its oomph. But it does line up well with Walton clearly wanting Victor's pole. But that might not have been deliberate. I say might because Mary Shelley was kinda bi, and began working on Frankenstein while hanging out with her cool bi friends. The idea was to connect the literal place you shouldn't go with the scientific place. That Walton would meet Frankenstein, hear his story, and be convinced to turn back before he unleashed his own monster. At least that's my reading of the story. I'm not sure if the metaphor works, to be honest. Frankenstein created new life, and through being a crap dad, he made it a monster. Walton would just kill himself and his crew. Just a few more notches on exploration's death list. Anyway, I'm going to spend the rest of this video talking about early polar explorers. Because for the mid-19th century is when things really hotted up. They were not the first people to race for the pole. North in this case. The first proper North Pole expedition was the 1773 Phipps expedition, and it was British. Two ships, the Racehorse commanded by Constantine Phipps, and the Carcass captained by Skeffington Lutwidge. The Carcass was clearly where they stored all the eccentric names. The Racehorse and the Carcass were bomb ships like the Terror and the Erebus. They were designed for toughness, to sit still and hurl bombs at the enemy, so they had to be tough, which made them the best choice for dealing with ice. But here's an interesting thing, they didn't think the pole would be icy. They thought they could force their way through the ice and get to an open polar sea, because the prevalent theory at the time was that ice only formed near land. This theory hadn't completely died out by the time of the Franklin expedition either, hence the use of large bomb vessels to try and find the Northwest Passage. They thought there might be an ice-free route up there, and the toughness was supposed to keep them intact until they found it. The Phipps expedition made it 80 degrees north, 8/9 of the way from the equator to the North Pole. Doesn't sound too impressive, but 80 degrees south wouldn't be reached until Scott's first expedition in the early 20th century. About a decade before Amundsen would hit the South Pole. They also discovered polar bears. At least scientifically, I doubt they were the first people ever to see them. And polar bears would figure in probably the most famous story to come out of the expedition. You see, a young midshipman serving on the Carcass was one Horatio Nelson. He of the massive erection fame, scourge of Napoleon's navy. And after Nelson became Nelson, patron saint of Englishmen at sea, old Skeffington started telling a story that I suspect is at least slightly made up. That Nelson, age 15, had tried to beat a polar bear to death with a rifle, because he wanted to take its skin back as a souvenir for his father. I don't know if you know how small Nelson was, but I've literally seen his bed on HMS Victory, and it would fit a large toddler. The idea of an even smaller version of him trying to beat anything to death is hilarious. Personally, though, I do think there's a kernel of truth to this story, that he shot at a bear and was yelled at by a superior officer. It is a fantastic story, though, and just added to Nelson's myth. The next large-scale expedition for the North Pole was the Parry expedition of 1827, also by the British. Because when they get a geographical obsession, they never give it up. Just like at Ireland. This expedition made it to 82 degrees, a new record that would stand for the next 50 years, when Albert Markham, designer of the flag of New Zealand, would smash it by an extra degree. The interesting part of the Parry expedition, though, was who was involved. Parry was basically the father of early 19th century polar exploration. His expeditions laid the groundwork for much of the next century in northern expeditions. He did the most complete traversal of Northwest Passage until Amundsen, he filled in much of the unexplored map, and even lost the HMS Fury at the well-named Fury Beach, leaving supplies for John Ross's ill-fated expedition decades later. He was an inspiration for everyone who came after him, and his expeditions featured an early cameo from a big name in that group, Francis Crozier. Crozier served in the HMS Hecla, the sister ship of the Fury, and it was one of Parry's expeditions that Crozier gave aid to a group of Inuit and learned the language. It was under Parry that Crozier got the nickname Agluka, meaning long strider, when he made friends with an Inuit man called Agluka, and they took each other's names as nicknames when dealing with each other's people. Something that would cause no end of debates, because the Inuit at the time had a tendency to call white explorers Agluka, because of how tall they were. So in the years after the Franklin expedition, the Inuit talked about the crew being led by Agluka, and historians have no idea if they meant Crozier or not.
Ask him if one of these men is the one he's calling Agluka.
Though probably not. Crozier also took part in Parry's North Pole expedition, featuring in this painting of a party going on their way. He's the man waving goodbye on the right side. I believe there are only 4 contemporary paintings of Crozier. This painting he commissioned, showing him and Ross visiting Franklin in Tasmania during their Antarctic expedition, and these 2 portraits. Apart from that, he can also be seen in this bust that was recently uncovered, and his famous daguerreotype. I find the representations of Crozier fascinating personally, because they all look very consistent, but nothing like the photograph of him. None of the paintings or the bust capture the photograph's harried column mini energy. Anyway, enough about that. Time to go back to the start and take a look at Pytheas, the first polar explorer. Now, this is a bit of a controversial thing to call him because there's some argument about where exactly he got to, but also whether it's fair to describe someone as the first anything explorer when they went to places that people already lived in. I would be happy to also call Pytheas the first British Isles explorer because he made first Greek contact with the ancient Britons and Irish. An exploration is always from the context of the explorer, not the explored. But like I said, there is some argument here. Pytheas was a Greek born in the Greek colony Massalia, now Marseille in France, and around 325 BCE he made his great voyage, where he left the Pillars of Heracles, sailed up Spain, made first Greek contact with numerous groups, including the Northern Celts, the Goths, and the Proto-Norse, circumnavigated Britain and Ireland. Fun fact, but for some reason, ancient maps based on Pytheas' writings about his voyage recorded Scotland at an angle. There's a few theories about why this is, but I tend to think it was a simple scribal error during copying that spread over time. Another fun fact, the word Britain itself is from the Greek translation of a Celtic word that was brought back to Greece by Pytheas. The only pieces of Pytheas' work that survive are in quotations in a later work, but according to Roman writer Strabo, he called Britain Britannicae, probably named after a Celtic tribe that he met. Anyway, after doing all that, Pytheas headed north and north and north, where he became the first person in recorded history to describe the Arctic, pack ice in the midnight sun. This man, from a people who had not yet invented trousers, took a boat that was designed for the Mediterranean all the way to the edge of the polar region, and he made it home again. I love his description of pancake ice, that he reached a region where land, sea, and air mixed and became one, where the sea had the appearance and consistency of jellyfish, and you couldn't sail through it or walk on it. He also discovered a desolate new land that he called Thule, or Ultima Thule to the Romans, and there's been a lot of debate over literal centuries about where he found. Everywhere from the Orkneys to Iceland to an island off the coast of northern Norway have all been suggested. I like the Iceland theory, though it's really fallen out of favour with scholars. I don't think it's very likely, but I love the idea of a Greek ship, a couple of years after the death of Alexander the Great, making it all the way to Iceland. Part of the issue is that based on existing copies of what's left of his work, it's impossible to tell what direction he travelled in to reach Thule. We just know it was 6 days sailing from Britain, that it was in the cold north, much colder than Britain, and it was populated with farmers, which kind of ruins the possibility it was Iceland, because it was kind of empty at that point. Iceland's first known inhabitants were either the Norse, settling 1,200 years later, or some Irish monks who might have arrived before the Norse. And if they did, that means the scene in Vikings, where Floki discovers an abandoned church in Iceland, is maybe the most historically accurate scene in the entire show. Pytheas was also the first known person to make the connection between tides and the moon.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that.
Maybe
It
it's
always comes
Thor
in,
on top of
it
Mount
goes
Olympus
out.
who's making the tides go in and out.
No, but you can't explain
a scam
that.
and a myth of the same.
This kind of makes sense because the Mediterranean has limited tides, so Greek scientists hadn't spent much time coming up with theories for them. And Pytheas was one of the first Greeks to really leave the Mediterranean and hit the Atlantic proper, with its much bigger tides. Anyway, I think I'll end it here. Pytheas really should be more well known. He was not only 2,000 years ahead of his time when it came to tides and the moon, but he named Britain, explored an incredibly huge area, got very cold. He did it while making first contact with multiple peoples and not invading anyone. As explorers go, he was pretty rad.